Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for another Salesforce Ben webinar, this time in collaboration with Progress. And today we're going to be speaking about maximizing your Salesforce savings with different data connectivity. Now, of course, in the world of 2024, integrating your data into Salesforce to create that 360-degree view is so important, but with also this AI wave coming over us, it's more vital than ever that we've got all of our customer data in one place. So that's what we're going to be speaking about today, is how to integrate all your data better into Salesforce. My name is Ben McCarthy, and I'm going to be your host for today, and I am the founder of Salesforce Ben. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. I'm joined by Brian from Progress, Data Direct, and Dee from Primacy. Brian has 20 years of data access and connectivity experience. At Progress, he leads technical direction and makes design and implementation decisions for Progress Direct. He is instrumental in helping customers solve real-world problems via integration of front-end tools through the full stack of data stores. And Dee is a Salesforce marketing champion and MarTech engineer, helping brands elevate their marketing stacks to the next level. Thank you so much for being here today, guys. I'm going to pass over the webinar to Brian and Dee.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Dee, for being here. Yeah, so we really want to dive into and talk about Salesforce Connect, some of the use cases and some of the connectivity solutions we have for integrating different external data stores with Salesforce Connect. Dee, what do you see as some of the industry use cases, and the people you talk to for Salesforce Connect?
Sure. Well, so as we know, Salesforce Connect provides a seamless integration of data across systems by letting users view, search, and modify data that's stored outside of the Salesforce org. So I see a lot in the marketing world where we're connecting Snowflake to Google Ads or Snowflake to Meta. We're also connecting Snowflake to BigQuery and then to Salesforce CRM, Salesforce Service, Salesforce Marketing Cloud. So Salesforce Connect is underlying in most organizations that I work with, and the use case is really for marketing is talking back to the systems, but also having a 360 view of the customer, especially if you're using other systems, not just CRM, to process data. And Salesforce Connect allows you to do that in a secure way.
Yeah, we see that here too with our customers. If they have marketing data that's external to Salesforce and they want to create Salesforce reports to integrate that external data, Salesforce Connect provides a method for them to integrate with that external marketing data via an OData connection. One of the great things that Progress provides is our hybrid data pipeline server, which allows you to configure connectivity to on-prem databases or marketing services or databases in the cloud. You can configure the gateway, which is what hybrid data pipeline is, to connect to this data and then expose any of that data via OData for consumption by Salesforce Connect. Salesforce Connect then exposes this data as external tables, and you can create reports with your and integrating your Salesforce data with these external sources.
Brian, do you want to explain a little bit about the Data Direct tool and how it can be used for multiple platforms?
Sure, Dee. Yeah, we have a product called the Hybrid Data Pipeline. This is essentially a lightweight data gateway that allows you to configure connectivity to multiple data stores. We support a whole slew of different of connections to cloud sources, on-prem sources. We have a connector that can expose REST data, as well as you can plug in any third-party JDBC driver for connectivity to sources we might not have enabled yet. And this allows you to expose this data through any number of standard connectivity solutions, ODBC, JDBC, or for this Salesforce Connect use case, OData.
Great. So you said on-prem and cloud. So is this a one-to-one connection with platforms? And can I have multiple platforms with one application, or do I have to have multiple applications? And what's the best case to do that?
Yeah, so it's a single data gateway that you can run as a standalone single node. It also supports clustering for high availability and failover. We have a regular installer as well as a Docker image that can be deployed either on-prem or in any of the public clouds behind a load balancer. The install goes pretty smooth. It should get up and running in a day or less. And then once you configure connectivity to your backend sources, you can then configure the connection to any of those sources to be exposed as OData. So Salesforce Connect will consume an OData stream, and this is where the power of the hybrid data pipeline really comes into play.
Thanks, Brian. What exactly is OData?
So OData is based on the REST API standard and allows SQL-like connectivity to backend sources. So Salesforce Connect will send requests that are formatted in OData to the hybrid data pipeline. The hybrid data pipeline can then take this OData and turn it into a SQL query to the backend source, whether it be Oracle, SQL Server, Snowflake, any number of sources that are supported by the hybrid data pipeline, and then return those results in an OData stream, which then is processed and exposed by Salesforce as an external table. The thing about this and the real power behind it is that Salesforce will not let you deploy any sort of JDBC or connectivity solution within the Salesforce ecosystem. So we handle the connectivity through the hybrid data pipeline and then allow Salesforce to consume the data return where the data is in place. The data itself is never copied or migrated over to Salesforce. It's just exposed on demand through these external tables that Salesforce Connect provides.
I can see this definitely taking a few apps off of my out of my system with just this connector. Great. And would you say that some of the use cases that you see are based around reporting, or how could you use the data from the Data Direct product? You said it can't be ingested and exposed. What exactly does that mean?
Well, so we're basically saying, we're not migrating any data into Salesforce itself. The data is queried on demand. So if you need a report that's going to integrate, say, some marketing data from an external source with something from your Salesforce CRM, we can provide that integration. When you configure the OData connectivity within the hybrid data pipeline, you actually control what fields and what tables are exposed from your backend sources. We even support database views. So if you create a view in Oracle, let's say, which then only returns specific data from tables joined together, you can then expose that view as an OData stream to Salesforce Connect. And when you run your report, the data will be pulled directly from Oracle into that report for consumption by your Salesforce users. Another cool thing about this is there's a real cost savings involved in that Salesforce charges for these OData endpoints per OData endpoint. So in general, that would mean if you were connecting Salesforce Connect to Snowflake, that would be a single endpoint. And then if you also wanted to connect it to Oracle, that would be another. Hybrid data pipeline allows you to group what we call these data sources, or we call it data source grouping. We can group those together and expose them as a single OData stream. So essentially, you would be able to pay Salesforce for a single OData endpoint as exposed out of it, which you're exposing out of Salesforce, and then configure hybrid data pipeline to return, let's say, both Oracle, Snowflake, and even Google BigQuery data all through that single endpoint. So you'd essentially kind of get 3 for 1 there.
Nice. I can see how this would be great for lead acquisition all the way to seeing if a customer converted. without having to move data, which I know is critical in a lot of businesses, so that security is top of mind, right? So I see that this is a way to still provide that data, but without, you know, any exposure of it, unneeded exposure, I guess I could say.
Yeah, and you mentioned security. You know, I'd just like to make sure everyone understands all of the data communicated through Hybrid Data Pipeline, not only through the nodes themselves, if you have a cluster, but then also out of Hybrid Data Pipeline and into Salesforce is all SSL encrypted. So, you know, we keep security as a top-notch priority here at Progress. And so, you know, not only are you able to maintain and keep your data source credentials hidden from the user, the Salesforce user, but also the data itself is going to be encrypted through any of the network communication that goes on.
Great. Just singing the tunes that I like to hear. So what would it look like if I were to want to sign up for this product today? What's the reality? Would I be able to set it up myself, or do I need a team?
Oh yeah, no, we try to make it easy to use, so you can sign up for a 30-day evaluation on our website at www.progress.com. Download the product. We have extensive documentation and quick start guide to essentially get you started. You know, all you really need is a Linux machine where you can either deploy the Docker image as a container or install the product itself. You get a fully functional 30-day evaluation. Give the installer a few pieces of input, and once installed, the Hybrid Data Pipeline is essentially listening on a few ports, such that we then expose a graphical web UI, which is our administration tool, allowing you to configure your specific connections to your backend sources. Once those are configured, you can then take an extra step and say you want to expose which data you want to expose out of those sources as the OData endpoint. And essentially, you then go into Salesforce and configure your OData endpoint out to the listener where Hybrid Data Pipeline is running. And it's really as simple as that. You know, once that's configured in Salesforce, you can start querying and seeing the data from these backend sources as external tables right in your org.
Nice. Wonderful. And in case I have questions, are there people there that can help me configure this? I have a pretty big team, but sometimes I'm responsible for these types of integrations.
Yeah, definitely. We have, you know, we have a team of great sales engineers to help out our prospects getting started. They frequently get involved with some of the Hybrid Data Pipeline evaluations, especially as customers go from a POC with a single node installation to, you know, wanting to consider a multi-node deployment in either Azure or Google Cloud or AWS, and they've got years of experience with the product and are always there, you know, to help via email or getting on a phone call to get you configured and up and running and answer any questions you have around configuration for this type of connectivity.
Nice. Okay, I have a couple of other questions. So when it comes, I heard you say Snowflake, I heard you say Azure, I heard you say Google Cloud. In most use cases, how many platforms are we using at like, how many platforms would you say it's typical to connect at one time?
So typically we see, you know, industry or any of our customers are using one cloud or another. So they may be using Azure. I think Azure and AWS are pretty much the two primary use cases we see, where a customer may want to deploy this as a multi-node installation. And like I said, it's a multi-node installation behind a load balancer so that you get the high availability and failover capabilities which these cloud providers enable. It really doesn't take a team of administrators to maintain a hybrid data pipeline installation. We really see only 1 or 2 people being in charge of the administration, configuring their users, and then managing upgrades through the deployment process that's available through AWS or through Azure. So it really does not require a large investment in for the administration of the product itself. Once it's up and running and you have things configured, really the only changes you might need to make are related to adding new data sources that you may want to expose, once you see the power of the product.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was really helpful. I know a lot of databases that I want to connect and see data from for my reports. I'm really looking forward to downloading this. I think you said we go to www.progress.com and there's a 30-day trial. Is it accessible from the website, or do we have to call you? How do we get the download?
Nope, it's fully accessible, fully functional, 30-day trial. You just go fill out a form on the website. You'll get an email with the download link. Once you download, you can either, like I said, deploy via Docker or to Linux. And we have lots of documentation around installing, getting configured for Salesforce Connect, configuring your data sources, and this is all done through our web UI. So it's pretty straightforward, really easy.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm going to do that later today. And if I have any questions, I'm going to call you.
Please do.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to Ben. Thank you, Ben, so much for having us on your webinar. So Ben, founder of Salesforce Ben, take it away.
Brian D, thank you so much for all that great information that is just so relevant in 2024 with everything going on. We're going to pause for a few seconds whilst we start reviewing the questions, and we'll be back in a minute to answer them. All right, we are back here to answer your questions. So thank you so much for everyone for being here today, and hopefully you enjoyed the chat between Dee and Brian. So yeah, I'll just wait for a few seconds just to see some of the questions coming in. I can see some coming in now. We do have a bit of time, so if you ask a question, I'm sure we can get around to answering it. So, okay, cool. Let's get kicked off. So, I guess, yeah, whoever wants to take this question, what are some of the most common use cases you see for Salesforce Connect?
Yeah, sure, I can take this, Ben. So we've seen customers coming in who are switching from an older on-prem CRM to Salesforce, but still need that legacy data. They essentially can then, as they transition to Salesforce being their current CRM, they can either import the legacy data into Salesforce tables, or if they just need to integrate any of this older data, they can use essentially Salesforce Connect as an OData, or with an OData endpoint that HTTP exposes to get to that legacy CRM data, but seeing it in Salesforce via the external tables. We also see people connecting if there's like a merger or some M&A goes on, and we have multiple Salesforce orgs. The current Salesforce org can be linked through HTTP out to the older or other Salesforce orgs that came with these companies that merged. And then this is especially true for marketing data, where people are viewing and updating marketing data from external sources within Salesforce itself.
Cool, fantastic, thanks so much. And there's one here from Francis. Are there any limits to the number of OData API calls?
I'm not aware of any limits. I might need to check in the Salesforce docs to see if they have limits on that. We have for the customer, we've never heard of any limits. So I might need to check on that and get back to you guys.
Yeah, it makes sense though that it wouldn't be any kind of strict limits just because the amount of data that does kind of pass through there. So thanks for your question, Francis. And what are some of the external data sources that you've seen used with Salesforce Connect?
So primarily, relational data. Since the data stays in place, one of the things that's great about this is not ETL. So if you need to see your Oracle data or SQL Server, PostgreSQL data, whether that data is on-prem behind a firewall, or whether it's in one of the cloud sources, HDP can expose those as their data streams. So it makes the connectivity out to the source of the data. So not only is it relational data, though, we also support cloud sources like Google BigQuery or Snowflake. We support REST sources. So if for some reason you wanted your Jira data, we have a customer, or we also have a customer who wanted to expose millions of rows of Cloudera Impala data and get that data into Salesforce for reporting. So, really anything that you can make a JDBC connection to, whether it's something we have a JDBC driver for, or whether it's even a third-party JDBC driver out to a source we may not have a connector for yet. All of those can be exposed, from their source through HDP out to Salesforce Connect.
Cool. And then a follow-up question from that: if they need to switch from one database to another, is that difficult?
No, HDP makes it really easy. So, when you configure the connectivity to this source, it basically HDP will give you a URL to then plug into your Salesforce Connect configuration. So, you've paid for Salesforce Connect with OData. You then can essentially configure that connectivity in Salesforce, where it's really nothing more than giving it the OData endpoint to connect to. So this is exposed by HDP. If you then want to switch to a different source where maybe you've gotten all the data you need, or that data is now so legacy that it's retired, and you configure a different data source coming out of HDP with a different OData endpoint, then you would just go back into Salesforce Connect, reconfigure it for that new OData endpoint that's exposed by HDP, and you're up and running. It's good to go. So the modification is quick, it's easy, fairly seamless.
Cool, that's great. And I'm going to need to put your pitch hat on, Brian, because Dean has asked, what is the value proposition of Progress, and why is it better than other connectors?
So, I mean, we've been a leader in data connectivity for literally like 30 years. Some of the, a lot of our OEM customers are large accounts that are providing ETL tools, as well as other applications for data access. We take security very seriously and keep all of our third-party libraries up to date. We're constantly monitoring for vulnerabilities in any of the third-party software we use, and keep those updated as fixes are available. Additionally, our performance is something we focus on to make sure that the data is moving fast, moving efficiently. One other actually piece of the value puzzle for this particular solution, which was, we mentioned earlier in the conversation, was this concept of data source grouping. So, Salesforce Connect is charged based on the number of OData endpoints. And so one of the things we do within the HDP configuration is allow you to configure a single OData endpoint that then actually makes connections out of HDP to multiple sources. So let's say you had Oracle and Snowflake data. You could group those two data sources together to be exposed by a single endpoint. And so now you can get your Snowflake data, get your Oracle data coming through HDP into Salesforce Connect with a single endpoint configuration. So you really only have to pay for one endpoint in Salesforce, but then get connectivity to multiple backends where you're pulling that data into external tables.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. And how is this different to MuleSoft?
Let's see, I might need to get back to you on that one. I will have to research that and get back. I don't have an answer for that one.
I think MuleSoft is very much a kind of kind of ETL tool with pre-made API templates. So I think it's for like lifting and shifting the data inside of Salesforce or outside of Salesforce, but not actually viewing it like Salesforce Connect does.
Yeah, and I believe MuleSoft is fairly complicated to configure, and we're cheaper as well. So yeah.
Great. So there's a question here about someone is concerned over maintaining control over sensitive data when using Salesforce Connect with HDP. What controls do you have to make sure that they don't expose sensitive data?
So we give you complete control over what data is exposed by the OData endpoint. So, in the UI, you go configure which tables and which columns you want exposed at all, so that when the data is sent or when it's queried by HDP from the back end and sent through the OData stream up to Salesforce Connect, we're only sending what you've configured to send. Additionally, if you wanted to further tighten security such that the data exposed is through a database view, you can essentially, configure your view so that only the tables and columns that you want exposed are returned in the results from that view, and then configure HDP to select from that view. So that gives you further control over, the user permissions that allow for which data, the user permissions on the database side, because you're configuring your connectivity inside HDP with a particular database user ID and password. And so based on the user permissions that are configured within the database, you have additional control.
Great. And question from Nazir here, how does this work with Data Cloud from Salesforce?
Data Cloud. I'm not sure on that one.
I would assume quite a different use case, because Data Cloud generally is a Salesforce product that's built on the core Salesforce platform, and then it has connectors to integrate into platforms like Snowflake or other big data lakes to pull in the data into Data Cloud. But as far as I'm aware, it operates on a very similar, what's it called, zero copy or something, where Data Cloud doesn't actually store the data, it just views the data. So I think it's like a similar offering to Salesforce Connect, but different use case. Another question here, how well will hybrid data pipelines scale when using Salesforce Connect?
So scalability is great. We basically scale horizontally by running 2 more nodes behind a load balancer. We have never seen a customer who really needs more than a 3-node cluster. And we've seen customers supporting 10 or 11,000 Salesforce users through HDP, OData, and Salesforce Connect, where their reps are wanting to view historical data in an older CRM. So the investment in the infrastructure that you need to run this solution is low, and it manages. It does scale. If for some reason you did need to scale it additionally, it's not hard to add another node and just keep things up and running.
Cool, fantastic. Thank you, Brian. I'll just pause there just in case we've got any other questions. We do have a bit of time if anyone has any burning questions that they want to ask Brian, myself, or Dee. Okay, and just before we sign off then, Brian, be good with just a question from me, but what are the primary benefits of using hybrid data pipeline with Salesforce Connect?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's really the real-time access to your single source of truth. Since we're not running any sort of ETL, It's not a snapshot of the data. When you execute your queries, when you run your reports, we're pulling the data live from the source where it resides. So you're getting a current view of that data. This additionally translates into cost savings by not having to continually import data to, keep the view fresh if that data is changing, if you're adding more data in the external source. And then back to the HTTP data source groups. Like I said, this really, since you can just basically pay for a single instance of Salesforce Connect, and then, group the data on HTTP to be exposed by that single OData endpoint, you're really saving money by running HTTP, whether it's a single node or in a cluster, to get to multiple sources of data.
Great, thanks so much. Cool, well, I haven't seen any other questions come in, so we can start wrapping up, and then if any questions come in the meantime, we can pick them up. But just like to reiterate my sentiments from earlier. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you really enjoyed the chat. It's integration has always been relevant for quite a few number of years now, and will continue to be relevant in the future. So yeah, I personally found that the chat really insightful. It's always good to learn about new products and Salesforce functionality as well. So Brian, thank you so much. Any final words before we sign off?
Yeah, I guess, one of the things we noticed is not a lot of people are essentially using Salesforce Connect. And I just encourage you to take a look at our solution here. It's really powerful, and, being able to query your data and link your Salesforce data out to any external data, can really enable some additional business insights.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And Dee, just before we go, any last words from yourself?
Thanks. I just want to thank everybody for being here. Again, I'm going to download the Progress Data Direct. I didn't get a chance to last week when we were talking about this webinar, but it's on my schedule to do. And after talking to some of my teams, they do feel that it's a great solution. So thank you, Brian, for bringing us through. And again, Ben, thanks for having me on your webinar.
Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you on the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye.